Teresa.
And I'm Callista, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime. And during our mini break, we went and saw the Last Downton movie, and we really liked it. What do you think?
I liked it. I mean, it always makes me kind of sad when there's a series or, movies that I actually like when it ends. But I didn't love the second one. I don't know if it was just because it was, I mean, I like France, but I just didn't love the second one. So I liked this one. And I mean, you could say maybe it was a little heavy handed at the end with all like the flashbacks of the Sybil and Matthew, and then, of course, Maggie Smith, and I know I teared up. So, yeah, I liked it.
Yeah, I really liked it. I guess someone could say it was heavy handed, but I didn't really think the ending was heavy handed. I mean, it's the end of how many seasons and three movies. They couldn't just end it as they had ended the others because there needed to be some kind of finality. And I thought the flashbacks were sweet and sad, of course.
Yeah, maybe heavy-handed was a little strong. I mean, I feel like if you've watched the whole series and you've watched the movies, yeah, you're right. They can't just end it with Robert, kissing his hand and, kissing the brick. You know what I mean? We are on to something new. No spoilers, but yeah. And I really liked, I mean, because of, the time that it's set in, I really like that, Mary's going to go on and she has George. What's the daughter's name?
That's the daughter she had with Matthew Good. I think the name is Charlotte.
Okay. I didn't remember that at all. But, like Mary's going to go on and she's going to be just fine. So, yeah, I liked it. And they all looked, I feel really bad when I say that. I mean, I look older too, obviously, from,
We all do.
but they looked a little older. So, I mean, I feel like they made Anna, Joanne Fogger, I think they made her look older because when was Sherwood Tate? I don't think that she looks that old. I think they tried to make her look more, for lack of a better term, like more matronly, you know?
Yeah, and to be fair, I feel like there was quite a time period between the second and third movie.
Yeah. Yeah, that might be. That might be. Yeah. And I was really worried that Tom wasn't going to come back because I like Tom. So, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it might be one of my favorite parts, his and Mary's friendship. And that was the part when they were talking near the end that I almost teared up because it gets me.
I know. I know. He's a little outsider. He comes in and then he's accepted by the family. And look at him now. And I know. And I feel like he's always, like, they've always had each other's back. So, yeah, it's nice. Yeah, it's nice. I mean, if you're not into Downton, I feel like it's not a like, oh, I'm going to go into this and not really, have an opinion. I mean, not that it's controversial at all, but I feel like you're either gonna love it and feel, like, really attached to the characters. It's not just a, like, ho-hum, "Oh, look, an episode's on. I'll kind of watch that." You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
No, I agree. Yeah, it's definitely, I feel like, character driven. So I feel like you get attached to the characters.
Definitely, and I was a little concerned not concerned in the beginning when, again, this really it isn't a spoiler, but Mary and Edith are shopping, and they're, like, having a good time, and they seem like friends, and I'm like, "Whoa, that's that's not their relationship, like, what are we doing? What is this, newfangled, we are friends, everything is fine." But no, some little snarky sister stuff came out, and so, yeah, I just really liked it.
Me too, me too. And I know some people didn't like it, but yeah, I feel like if you were into the series, you're probably gonna like it.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's kind of hard to, I feel like, finalize something that people like really loved or even finalize things that people didn't love and make everyone happy. But I don't know how you wouldn't be happy with that, you know? Yeah, I thought it was true to like the original storyline and to the characters. Nothing was like, oh, that doesn't make sense. What's going on there?
Definitely. I definitely felt that it felt like a continuation as opposed to like as sometimes happens when they do movies after a series where we're really reaching at the bottom of the barrel to find a new storyline and that completely goes against everything we've set up prior to this.
That's true. I mean, because when the series opened, what was it, 19? I always get that confused. I always think the Titanic was 1917. Is it 1912 or is it 1917? Do you
No, I
know?
think yeah, the Titanic sank in 1912, didn't it?
Yeah, I always, for some reason, think, yeah, I think you're right. I think, anyway, And then isn't this supposed to be set, like, is it 1930?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the beginning, it's all about, like, marry off the daughters, do all these things, and then, I mean, we tie it up with, look, I mean, definitely George is going to take over Downton when he's of age, but look at Mary. She's now, head of Downton. I thought that was, like, a nice, like, full circle kinda thing.
Yeah, definitely, I agree.
Yeah. Any other comments?
No,
Okay, let's start, I guess, our episode then. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, we are continuing with our theme of female killer nurses. Today, we will be talking about Kristen Gilbert, who chose to murder vulnerable, either physically or mentally, veterans at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. The main motive for these murders seemed to be Kristen's ill guided belief that she would impress the man she was having an affair with, who happened to be a security guard at the VMCA. And if you're wondering how killing patients is going to impress your paramour,
You know I am.
we will get there. But first, let's find out where it all began. Kristen Heather Strickland was born on November 13th, 1967, in Fall River, Massachusetts. And if you're racking your brain trying to figure out why that town sounds familiar, Callista, will you enlighten us?
Sure, that's the town in which Lizzie Borden allegedly killed her stepmother, Abby, and her father, Andrew, with a hatchet in 1892. If you want to hear why we, like pretty much everyone else, think Lizzie got away with murder, we covered that case in episode 7.
Thanks for that. And if you haven't, you should definitely listen to that episode.
Honestly, it's one of my favorites. I love an old-timey case.
Yeah, me too. Kristen was the eldest of two daughters born to Richard and Claudia. Richard was an electronics executive, and Claudia was a part time teacher and homemaker. Kristen's early years were unremarkable. However, as she entered her teens, some troubling behavior began to show. She lied often and bent the truth to make herself look better.
Alberta Erickson, who lived across the street from the Stricklands in Groton, Massachusetts, said of Kristen, she lied a lot, and she had this blank stare as if she was trying to make things up as she went along. Kristen would also brag about being a distant relative of Lizzie Borden. This was most likely to make herself seem more interesting, having moved from the city where the Borden murders took place, in the hope of getting a reaction from this salacious tidbit. Because if you actually were a descendant, I'm not sure you'd lead with that fact. Alberta's daughter, Pamela Smethurst, was friends with Kristen, and they would often watch the soap opera General Hospital after school. Pamela said that Kristen commented that she liked one of the most conniving characters.
And I haven't watched a soap since, God, I was a teenager, but I feel like at least 50%, maybe 70, of the characters on those shows could be described as conniving.
Oh, definitely. I mean, they're not known for their realism, they're known for the drama.
That's for sure.
Kristen and Pamela would often sit together on the bus to and from school. Pamela recalled an incident when she had searched all over her house for one of her favorite shirts, only to notice Kristen wearing the exact shirt a few days later. Kristen made up a lie about the shirt, but Pamela was sure that Kristen had stolen the shirt when she had been at her house. The friendship fizzled after that. Kristen was smart and a good student and gravitated towards science and math, even joining the school's math club. Several high school boyfriends said Kristen was manipulative and would abuse them both verbally and physically. When she was upset, she would scratch them and would mess with their cars. Regardless of Kristen's behavior, she graduated early at the age of 16 with honors from Groton Dunstable Regional High School in 1984. Kristen enrolled at Bridgewater State College in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, but after a fake suicide attempt where she claimed to have swallowed glass, as well as after several violent threats to other students, the school required her to seek psychiatric treatment, as they should have.
Yeah. Years later, Richard Strickland would tell a psychiatrist that his daughter was a habitual liar who once convinced her college roommate that her mother was an abusive drunk, which wasn't true. Kristen left Bridgewater and enrolled at Mount Wachusett Community College and later at Greenfield Community College. While in college, Kristen got a job as a home healthcare worker. One of her patients was a foster child who was blind deaf, and nonverbal. Kristen gave the boy a bath and put him to bed. When his foster parents went to check on him after Kristen had left, they found that he had been severely scalded by too hot bath water. They called Kristen's employer, but she was never charged. Kristen graduated with her registered nursing degree in 1988.
Already, Kristen's employers are doing a bang up job of protecting their patients.
It does seem to be the norm.
Sadly,
Later that year, Kristen married Glenn Gilbert after dating for 3 years. Glenn, a Northampton native, worked for an optical lens company. Kristen began her nursing career at Northampton's VAMC on March 6, 1989. In the beginning, work seemed to be going well for Kristen. She found the work challenging and got along well with her coworkers. Colleagues appreciated her can do, take charge attitude. Kristen was young, pretty, and popular. She often hung out with her coworkers after her shift at the nearby VFW bar. Karen Abderhalden, a nurse that worked with Kristen, said that she coordinated the yearly Secret Santa and manned the yearly gift drive for families in need. Bernard LaFlamme, a VA clinical nursing coordinator, said there were no problems with Kristen's nursing ability, and her proficiency reports commended her work, indicating that she was highly skilled in medical emergencies and was able to remain calm. Because of this, she was often assigned to the ICU. Things began to shift in Kristen's life when she started working the night shift in 1990. She gave birth to her first son at the end of 1990 and returned to work in March of 1991. Upon her return to work, she was permanently assigned to the 4 p.m. to midnight shift. On Kristen's 26th birthday, November 13th, 1993, she gave birth to her second son. After her maternity leave, she returned to the VAMC in early 1994.
when Kristen returned to her night shift schedule, she noticed a new hire, James Perot, who had begun working for the VA security team. James was hopeful that going from his department store security gig to being a part of the security team at the VAMC would help propel him to his real goal of being a police officer. James worked the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, and along with patrolling the hospital's grounds, he was also assigned to the security desk. Security officers would rotate positions, so after patrolling the grounds, he would have desk duty for 2 hours. Additionally, hospital procedures dictated that the officer manning the security desk was required to respond to all cardiac emergencies or codes. James, when walking his rounds, would often stop and talk with Kristen because they had a lot in common. He would frequently join his coworkers at the local VFW bar after work. James knew Kristen was married and had 2 young sons, but she alluded to the fact that her 7-year marriage was on the rocks. James and Kristen exchanged emails because that's what people did before tech were a thing. The emails started innocently enough, with Kristen and James sending funny jokes to each other. But friendly and funny soon turned into sexy and suggestive. Talking became flirting, and then one night when they were hanging out at the VFW with their coworkers, James walked Kristen to her car and they shared their first kiss. This kiss graduated to makeout sessions, then into a full-blown affair. Glenn was busy with work and taking care of his boys while Kristen was at work. He didn't have any inkling that his wife was having an affair. He was aware that their marriage had hit a rough patch, but thought things would work out. But he did notice that Kristen had begun buying fewer takeout meals and prepared meals from the store, and had started cooking more homemade meals. He also noticed that these home-cooked meals tasted a little funny.
Though it was never confirmed, it was suspected that Kristen slipped a diuretic, which she could have easily obtained from the hospital, into Glenn's food. This would increase his urine output, which would cause headaches, dizziness, dehydration, and low potassium. Kristen was unhappy in her marriage, and she wanted Glenn out of her life. She tried several different drugs to see how they would affect her husband.
Gotta test out the medications to see which works best as a poison.
I mean, she wanted to get it right. On November 5th, 1995, after feeling sick all day and getting progressively worse, Kristen drove Glenn to the emergency room at Cooley Dickinson Hospital. While there, Glenn was treated for low potassium and glucose levels. He was sent home with his more than capable wife. She was a nurse after all. About a week later, Glenn was feeling sick again. Kristen told Glenn she wasn't happy with the care he had received at the hospital and wanted to take a blood sample so she could test it at work. They headed to the bathroom so Kristen could take care of her ill husband. Glenn said Kristen had two syringes. One was full of clear liquid. She wrapped a tourniquet around his arm and told him that she needed to flush the vein with saline before drawing blood. This is not standard procedure with a blood draw, but she was hoping Glenn wouldn't be aware of that.
Is it just me who's kind of shocked he's never had blood drawn before?
I mean, maybe he thought she knew a better way.
That's a good point.
Glenn would later recall that he immediately felt a cold sensation and that it looked like the color was draining from his arm. He tried to pull away and asked Kristen to stop. She declined, pinned his body to the bathroom wall with her hip, and completed the injection. Glenn said he passed out, and when he came to a few minutes later, Kristen said that he had fainted at the sight of the needle and angrily said that this just wasn't going to work. She didn't attempt to draw blood, left the house, and returned to work. Glenn's spidey senses were tingling, and he wondered if continuing to live with Kristen meant that his days were numbered.
I would sure say so.
Kristen's attorney would later say that this was an insignificant, harmless incident, and that if Kristen had been intent on harming her husband, she could have done this while he was passed out on the bathroom floor.
Yeah, she only attacked him. She didn't kill him. What's all the fuss about?
I mean, defense attorneys, they're a special breed.
And to be fair, a lot of times they don't have a lot to work with.
Definitely, that is true. Kristen and James's relationship was ramping up when one day over breakfast, Kristen, with no proof, told James that Glenn was abusive. Kristen is a manipulative liar, so it's not surprising that she lies about being abused. But my God, this is one of the many things that piss me off in life. Women lying about being abused. There are so many women that are actually abused by their partners, and society does such a pathetic job of believing these women that lying about abuse is simply vile.
Overgeneralizing the lies of a few to say every one of them must be lying is just an excuse not to help survivors because, that would require work.
So true.
James gave Kristen an ultimatum: leave Glenn or he would leave her. Kristen sat at the table for a minute, then got up, walked to the payphone in the food court because this breakfast of champions was taking place at the local mall, called her husband, and told him their marriage was over. On December 1st, 1995, Kristen left her 2- and 5-year-old sons with their father and moved out of the family home. She moved into an apartment in nearby East Hampton, conveniently close to James. Glenn initially wanted to save his marriage.
Which is mildly shocking since his dear wife had tried to kill him.
It's just tragic. Presumably, she had manipulated him so that he felt staying with her was in his best interest, when the opposite was actually true.
Yeah, I'm sure she was quite the actress when needed.
Oh, I'm sure. When asked what he thought of James, he said, "I disliked his character."
Which I think sums up things nicely.
100%. Back to the summer of 1995. Earlier that year, Kristen was assigned to work on Ward C, which was a 26-bed acute care unit in the hospital's main building. Kristen was often assigned to the 4-bed intensive care unit, where she would monitor patients from the nurses' station. After Kristen's move to Ward C, they began experiencing an uptick in patient deaths. As with many of the other nurses we've covered, the night shift seems to be the perfect environment for a nurse with murder on their mind. In August of 1995, 66-year-old Stanley Jagodowski, a Korean War Army veteran who had worked as a truck driver and had a history of heart problems, was admitted to the hospital for post-operative bowel obstruction. Stanley was improving, and on August 21st, his doctor told him his condition was stable enough to move to a nursing home the next day. Two LPNs would later say they had seen Stanley around 8:45 p.m. and he was fine.
While leaving Stanley's room, one of the nurses noticed Kristen, who had started her shift at 4 p.m., with a needle and a swab heading into his room to flush his intravenous line with saline to keep it open. Stanley didn't need any injections, all his medications were oral.
I'm getting major Margaret Bradley, Janine Hanna vibes from that.
Yeah, me too. While Kristen was in Stanley's room, another LPN heard Stanley yell, "It hurts, you're killing me." She then saw Kristen leave Stanley's room. Stanley suffered a cardiac arrest and died 3 hours later. Though there were whispers about Kristen being in Stanley's room and his death later that night, nurses also knew that Stanley had a history of heart problems, so no suspicions were raised at this time. On December 8th, 1995, Jennifer Houdon answered a call from a VAMC doctor who said Henry was gone. She thanked him for calling and hung up. She was used to getting calls from the VAMC that her son, 35-year-old Henry, had left the hospital once his medication had kicked in. Henry, who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, had been a regular patient at the hospital for over a decade. Jennifer was grabbing her keys and purse to see if she could intercept Henrietta's apartment and try to coax him back to the hospital when the phone rang. It was the doctor again, telling her, "Please don't hang up. Henry's gone. He's dead."
I completely understand why the doctor wasn't that blunt to start with, but you can't blame Jennifer for misunderstanding either.
It's sad.
It is.
Henry Houdon was born prematurely on February 5th, 1960, but grew up healthy and strong and was a well liked kid who did well in school. Henry idolized his dad, who had served in the Air Force, and decided that he too wanted to serve his country. After basic training, he became an assistant physical therapist and was stationed at the Royal Air Force Station in Lakenheath, an Air Force base located northeast of London. Henry got on well with the other airmen and was even named Airman of the Month.
But as we all know, life is cruel. One night, Henry was with some other military personnel at a crowded pizza place when a fight broke out. An officer sitting near Henry asked if he could intervene in the melee and calm things down. It was while he was being a stand up guy that Henry was struck by a beer bottle with enough force that it knocked him to the ground, which he hit hard enough to detach his retina. Henry was in a coma for 3 weeks. When he emerged from the coma, his older sister, Christine, said he wasn't the same. He was emotional and argumentative. His hand shook and he heard voices. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was sent home to the US. And just as a traumatic brain injury can change someone's personality, it can also increase the risk of schizophrenia. Even though it's rare, it is possible. For the next decade, Henry's mental health was often in flux. He would take his medication, it would work for a while, then it wouldn't, and he would be admitted to the VAMC, where he would stay for a week or more. His meds would be adjusted, and then he would leave, usually without being discharged. December 7th, 1995 fell into this established pattern. Henry felt better after his meds were adjusted, so he left the hospital unannounced. The hospital called Jennifer, as they always did, and let her know that Henry had left. Jennifer met Henry at his apartment, where he told his mom that he thought he had maybe contracted something at the hospital because he was feeling sick. He told her he was going to rest and would call her tomorrow if he felt worse. True to his word, the next day, Henry called his mom and told her he thought he had a bad case of the flu. Jennifer took Henry back to the VAMC. Instead of being admitted to the psychiatric ward as he usually was, Henry was directed to Ward C. He was checked into the ICU at 2 p.m. and yelled, "Don't leave me here. I can't be in this building. People are dying around here for no reason." Jennifer went to Henry, who was in a wheelchair waiting for a room, and asked him why he was scared. He said that patients and staff were talking about people dying on Ward C. Jennifer thought this reaction could be because Henry was used to being in a different part of the hospital, or because the medication change was causing delusions. Jennifer tried to soothe Henry. She assumed that the hospital would be the best place for him. An orderly who was familiar with Henry reassured him by saying that nothing was going to happen to him. He had the flu and was going to get better. Before walking away, the orderly promised to check on him the next day.
No one is sure exactly what Henry had heard. The chatter among staff about increased deaths or missing medication, or if Henry was suffering delusions that seemed real. We will never know. Jennifer recalls Henry saying, and this is heartbreaking, "I know I'm a nut, but I'm your son. Can't you believe me just this one time? I don't want to die here." Jesus, we as a society need to treat mentally ill patients better and make it clear to them that it is an illness.
And that they're not at fault for having it. It's just tragic that it seems like he knew what was going on.
It really is. Henry said, "Don't leave me here, Mama. I don't want to die." Jennifer said, and I'll never forget it, "I looked into his face as he sat in this wheelchair. They put his little belongings in a black trash bag. I made the nurse put a little piece of tape on it that said Henry Hooten, and I'll see him there for as long as I live. Every time I go to the cemetery, I tell him, 'I'm sorry I brought you up there.'"
Of course, it's in no way Jennifer's fault, but you couldn't help but blame yourself in that situation.
Yeah, I really feel for her and her continued pain.
Me too.
Investigators believe Kristen, after being on shift for less than 2 hours, walked to Henry's bedside a little before 6 p.m. and injected him with epinephrine. Henry went into cardiac arrest at 5:48 p.m. He would have 3 more heart attacks before he died around 10 p.m. Prosecutors would later argue that Kristen murdered for the attention and the thrill of it. She relished the spotlight and was excited when a code blue was called. Kristen, exhibiting main character energy and wanting to play the starring role, knew that James would be called to the codes, and she wanted to perform for him. She wanted him to see the power she wielded over the patients. Witnesses to this behavior said that Kristen would look at James during the codes and smile and wink at him.
It's unbelievably awful, but it's also just really fucking weird.
It truly is. And why wasn't he immediately creeped the hell out?
He should have been, but maybe she was always weird, so this didn't seem out of character.
I'm sure that is true. Coworkers noticed Kristen leaving her shift to meet up with James and quickly running through her assigned tasks so that she could leave as soon as her shift ended to be with him. In early 1996, patient deaths that coincided with Kristen's shifts could no longer be ignored. The nursing staff began monitoring Kristen, hoping that their suspicions would be unfounded.
Kristen's method of murder was epinephrine, the synthetic chemical twin of adrenaline, which produces the body's fight or flight response. For patients suffering from a cardiac arrest, epinephrine can be a lifesaver. However, when injected into a person with a healthy heart, it can cause anxiety, a rise in blood pressure, and soaring heart rates. It causes the heart to beat so fast that it results in cardiac arrest. Epinephrine is colorless, odorless, breaks down quickly, and is difficult to trace. It was the perfect weapon for Kristen. The VA hospital stocked 2 different strengths of epinephrine. One was packaged in a large, pre-filled syringe and was designed to revive heart attack victims. The other was 10 times more concentrated, packaged in a small glass ampule and used on patients with anaphylactic shock due to an allergic reaction or a bee sting. During the time that Kristen was killing or trying to kill sick veterans that were entrusted to her care, a review of medical records indicated that there was no authorized use of a stronger dose of epinephrine on Ward C. Yet, several nurses said that they noticed the smaller ampules in the ICU's sharps container after patients experienced cardiac incidents during Kristen's shifts. One concerned nurse who was skeptical of all the cardiac arrests happening while Kristen was working began keeping a log of how many of these small epinephrine vials are being used. A later review of the records on Ward C could not account for 88 of the 135 ampules that were used between August 20th, 1995 and February 17th, 1996. Towards the end of this period of unexplainable epinephrine usage, Francis Marier, a 72-year-old World War II veteran, went into cardiac arrest on December 20th, 1995. Frances was the victim of Kristen's wrath when her request to leave early was denied. It is assumed, though there is no concrete evidence, that Kristen injected Frances with epinephrine, but fortunately, this combat veteran who survived the horrors of war also survived the horror of Kristen.
A little over a month later, on January 22nd, 1996, Thomas Callahan was seeking treatment for pneumonia and pulmonary disease when he suffered a life threatening cardiac arrhythmia. Thomas was stabilized and survived. A nurse who was covering Kristen's patients while she was on break said she checked the Sharps container and found two broken ampules of epinephrine. As January turned into February, the tryst between Kristen and James showed no sign of slowing down. Kristen and James practiced the dying art of letter writing, professing their love with pen and paper. Colleagues said Kristen was enamored with James, and because his shift ended an hour before hers, she was always really antsy to leave as soon as her shift ended at 12, or earlier if possible.
God, I'd say she's like a teenager in her need to get to him immediately, but maybe that's unfair to teenagers.
I mean, she does seem like the infatuated girl with her new boyfriend.
Uh-huh.
On February 2nd, 1996, Kristen was hell-bent on leaving work early. She and James had a late date planned, and work was not where she wanted to be. Kristen had started her shift at 4 p.m. and saw she was scheduled to work the ICU. There was only one patient in the ICU that night, 41-year-old Army veteran Kenneth Cutting, who had been in the ICU for the last 5 days. Kenneth was blind and suffered from multiple sclerosis. He had been a patient at the VMCA on and off for the last 20 years. Walter, Kenneth's dad, said his son had a kind heart, and even though his illness was a challenge, his disposition was cheery and friendly, as evident in his familiar greeting to his dad of, "Boy, you look good today."
Oh,
I know. Kristen took her dinner break at 6 p.m., and when she returned from her break, she asked an unbelievable question to her nursing supervisor. If Kenneth died, could she leave early? Her surprised supervisor said, "Yes." How is that your only response?
why not question why she's asking? We can't always assume someone's joking.
Yeah, my God. Anyway, exactly at 7:10 p.m., Kenneth suffered a heart attack and died. Kristen took Kenneth's body to the morgue and clocked out soon after.
2 days later, a Marine Corps veteran, Angelo Vella, was a patient on Ward C. Angelo said that Kristen came into his room and put some type of medication in his IV, which he didn't question because why would he? Angelo immediately felt flushed and started having stomach and chest pains. He remembered another nurse coming in and yelling at Kristen to take the IV out. Then he passed out. Nurse Kathy Ricks was working on Ward C on the evening of February 15th, 1996. Kathy, along with several other nurses on Ward C, were leery of Kristen and had been keeping a close watch on her. Because of her belief that Kristen was harming her patients, Kathy checked the medication cabinet and counted 3 ampules of epinephrine at the start of Kristen's shift. Kristen was assigned as the only nurse on the ICU that night for a single patient, 68-year-old Army veteran Edward Squira, who had a history of heart problems. At 5:07 p.m., barely an hour after Kristen clocked on, Edward went into cardiac arrest. He died 3 days later. In the wake of Edward's cardiac arrest, Kathy looked at his medical chart. There was no record of epinephrine use. Kathy then went to the medical cabinet and discovered that all 3 ampules from the evening of February 15th were gone. When she looked in the Sharps container, she found the 3 broken vials. 3 days after Edward's death, a patient with AIDS was on Ward C for an antibiotic treatment. He told a nurse that he felt nauseous, experienced a burning sensation, and passed out after Kristen said she flushed his IV line. This was the last straw. Several nurses reported their suspicions to their superior, and an investigation was launched. Officials had finally opened a formal inquiry into the deaths on Ward C. Kristen, not wanting to hang around and wait for the outcome, quit. Unsurprisingly, the death rate on Ward C dropped dramatically in Kristen's absence. Enraged that her coworkers were accusing her of harming and murdering some of her patients, Kristen insisted to James that she had done nothing wrong. She demanded that James keep her in the loop and tell her what her former colleagues were saying about her. James did what she asked and shared whatever information he could glean from conversations among the staff on Ward C.
Though he was initially supportive and believed Kristen, as time passed, James was having a hard time ignoring the conversations he was hearing at work. He stopped telling Kristen what her former coworkers were saying and began to wonder if what they were saying was true. Kristen was angry and blamed her coworkers for the deaths that had happened on Ward C. Any incidents were their fault. She was just the scapegoat. James suggested that Kristen move out of Northampton, at least for a while, but she refused and said that she would be found innocent of any wrongdoing and that she would not be pushed out of her town.
Alrighty then, Kristen.
Kristen was interviewed by the Veterans Affairs Office of Healthcare on March 8, 1996. Investigators asked Kristen why she was present at the bedside of so many patients who were either in distress or dying. Kristen, ever the narcissist, said that her medical intuition was just really fine tuned. Was this like Lorelei smelling when it was going to snow?
That's great. If only it were that innocent.
Yeah, if only. Kristen then said that the CNAs and LPNs really looked up to her and they would always come to her when a patient was in distress because she was the best in codes and everyone knew it. So, due to her elevated skill, this is why she was in the room of so many coding patients.
Yeah, I'm sure no one else had any idea what they were doing. Here comes Kristen to the rescue.
I know. As part of the grand jury investigation, James was served with a summons. Predictably, James and Kristen's relationship was becoming strained. By June, James was ready to end their relationship. Kristen begged him not to end things. He was her only support. He said while at his apartment, she went into the bathroom and came out a few minutes later and threw an empty pill bottle at him and said, "Look what you made me do." Seems Kristen was reverting back to her prior behavior of faking a suicide attempt.
Toxic much?
Yeah, most definitely.
Kristen's life was quickly unraveling. Her relationship with James was coming to an end. She was getting divorced, and most alarmingly, she was being investigated for murdering her patients. During the time that investigators were compiling evidence against her, Kristen's mental health started suffering. Between several psychiatric hospital stays, a former coworker, Karen Abderhalden, allowed Kristen to live with her. She said she was upset that James and her coworkers weren't supporting her. Ever the victim, Kristen told one psychiatrist that she was innocent, but that the VA hospital had unlimited money and resources and they just don't stop. Because clearly it's a conspiracy, and everyone knows that veteran services are overfunded, not underfunded.
She just really needs to play the victim.
Apparently. Having spiraled even further, on July 8th, Kristen was taken by ambulance to Holyoke Hospital after taking an overdose of Fiorinol, a medication used to treat tension and migraine headaches. The next day, while in the hospital, Kristen called James, telling him, "You know I did it. I did it. You wanted to know? I killed those guys." About a week later, James was scheduled to be interviewed by investigators. As he was leaving his apartment, he saw that Kristen had blocked his car and was begging him not to go. He told her to leave and that if she didn't, he would have one of the neighbors call the cops. Pissed off as she was, she did leave. However, while James was driving to the interview, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw Kristen following him. When he looked up again, she was gone. After he walked out of the 2-hour interview, James found that the air had been let out of his right front tire. During the following week, James's car was egged, scratched several times, and his windshield was spray painted. James confronted Kristen about the damage, but she denied doing anything to his car.
Kristen's rageful behavior was ramping up, and she had a plan. On September 26th, Kristen went to the Toys R Us in the Hollyoak Mall. Remember Toys R Us? It makes me sad that kids no longer have the opportunity to be overwhelmed by the latest and greatest toys in the form of a store dedicated to them.
It was definitely an experience, but do you need as many toys when you have an iPad?
I mean, I guess not. Kristen purchased a Talk Girl Jr., which is a toy that has the ability to disguise, distort, and record your voice. First, why would a toy like this exist? Second, if you really want one, eBay has this vintage toy for $129.99.
Wow, I mean, I guess you could use it to fool your friends, but it looks like it was based off the prop used in Home Alone 2 Lost in New York.
Oh, that's good. Around 3:30 that afternoon, Glenn received an unnerving message on his answering machine. I just wanted to say goodbye for the last time. Goodbye.
And the imagined robotic voice is not lessening the creep factor.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah.
Kristen's neighbor recalled seeing Kristen leaving her apartment around 5 p.m. that night. Kristen knew James' schedule and knew that he would be assigned to the security desk starting at 5 p.m. for 2 hours. A little after 5 p.m., James began getting odd phone calls. He said the voice on the phone sounded distorted and mechanical. The first call said he sounded dumb. The second told him he sounded pretty stupid. Finally, James got another call, still distorted, but this time it sounded a little lower, like a man's voice. The caller said, there are 3 explosive devices in Building 1. You have 2 hours. Obviously, this threat had to be taken seriously by the staff. The staff scrambled to get 50 patients out of the building and moved into another building nearby until Building 1 could be searched. Thankfully, no explosive devices were found. The next night, James received 2 more anonymous calls. James rightly thought that the calls were personal and directed at him, and believed that Kristen was making the calls and somehow disguising her voice. James was off September 28th and 29th, and the VMCA received no disturbing calls. On September 30th, Kristen trekked back to the Holyoke Mall's Toys R Us. This time, she purchased a Talk Boy Jr. The only difference between the 2 talking toys is that the Talk Girl Jr. is pink, because, girls will only play with toys that are pink. Gender marketing at its finest.
Way to entrench those gender stereotypes when they're young.
I'm not sure that has improved much in almost 30 years.
Not by much. Almost 4 hours into his shift, and after nearly 2 hours on the security desk, James received several more phone calls. One of the calls said, Officer Perro, I've been watching you, boy. James said the only difference with the calls received on this night was that the caller was trying out a southern drawl, which I'm not going to do. Both admissions and the nurse's station on Ward C also received electronically altered voice recordings. Needing a drink after the unsettling phone calls, James went to the VFW bar, the one he often stopped at on the way home from work, and the one he and Kristen had been to together numerous times. A little after he arrived at the bar, he received a phone call. The odd mechanical voice delivered the following ominous message. You think you have a problem? Just wait and see what I have planned for you. When James got home that night, he found a letter that Kristen had written to him, saying that she had been watching him and that a few days ago, she had driven by the VFW bar and saw his car in the parking lot. She said she could see him through the window of the bar playing darts.
Stalker much?
Right? James met with investigators the next day, and they asked him to call Kristen when he started working on the security desk that night. With the surveillance team monitoring several payphones near Kristen's apartment, James called Kristen's phone, got her answering machine, and asked her to call him, telling her he would be at the security desk until 7 p.m. James then received a series of disturbing calls at 5:25, 5:41, 5:44, and 6:37, with the same distorted voice as on all the other calls. The 5:41 p.m. and 5:44 p.m. calls were traced to a public payphone at a Citgo gas station.
Shortly before the 6:37 p.m. phone call, State Trooper Kevin Murphy, who was on surveillance outside of the Tasty Top, an ice cream stand, saw Kristen drive to the stand and use the payphone. Trooper Murphy radioed Special Agent Plant, another member of the surveillance team, who called James. James confirmed that he had just received a call and there was traffic noise in the background. Agent Plant checked for fingerprints on the payphone and he was able to lift a fingerprint, which would later be confirmed to be Kristen's. Kristen would subsequently admit that she had used the payphone outside of the Tasty Top, but only so she could check her home answering machine.
Because she's so important that she just couldn't wait until she got home to see who needed to get in touch with her.
I mean, are you trying to poke holes in her story?
It's like I don't even need to, they're already there.
Acting quickly on the information they had obtained, a search warrant was executed on Kristen's apartment. Officers found several empty battery packages and a drugstore receipt for the purchase of the batteries. Detective Lieutenant Thomas Soutier seized a Talkboy Jr. from the closet in the children's bedroom, along with a blank cassette tape and instructions for the toy. The VAMC received no more distorted anonymous calls. Before her arrest on the bomb threat charge, Kristen vacillated between being excited and depressed by the attention the case was receiving from reporters with camera crews in tow. Her freedom didn't last long. She was arrested on October 8th. As she awaited trial, insisting to whoever would listen that she would never intentionally hurt anyone, authorities began exhuming the bodies of the men who died on Ward C while Kristen was on duty.
Bruce Koenig, a government expert, tested both the Talk Girl Jr. and Talk Boy Jr. toys by changing the speed variance from high to low and then increasing and decreasing the playback speed. One of Kristen's coworkers, who had worked with her for 5 years, and her ex-husband Glenn, both identified the voice on the recording as Kristen's. Kristen's trial for calling in the fake bomb threat started on January 7, 1998. Prosecutors argued that Kristen wanted to retaliate against her former coworkers and former boyfriend for participating in the investigation against her. She was convicted and sentenced to 15 months in federal prison. While Kristen was serving her sentence at the Hampton County Correctional Center in Ludlow, she was preparing for her trial by talking to her lawyers several times a week. In addition to helping her lawyers, Kristen had started writing a novel, a murder mystery to be exact. Prison officials became aware of this when they reviewed her phone calls. It's not indicated who these phone calls were with, but we assume family or friends because her lawyers would have known that all calls were recorded and warned her about this. Kristen said that she drew on some life experience for the plot. The book was set in a government-owned building, there was theft, and, of course, murder. She hadn't fleshed out the entire plot, but she was thinking about making the murder victim a security guard. Her work in progress was seized, even though Kristen was adamant that her magnum opus was a complete work of fiction. Kristen's trial was set to begin in November 2000. Capital punishment was abolished in Massachusetts in 1984, and the last woman executed in the state was on July 2nd, 1778. However, because the crimes occurred on U.S. property, Kristen was eligible for the federal death penalty, and Attorney General Janet Reno approved the decision to seek the death sentence.
A little over a month before the trial was set to begin, 800 prospective jurors gathered at the Springfield Symphony Hall, which was rented because there wasn't a room at the courthouse large enough to hold that many people. The potential jurors completed a 15, imagine what you ask, a 15-page questionnaire. And for weeks after their initial meeting, jurors were required to go to the courthouse for follow up questions. 12 jurors and 6 alternates were chosen and would spend from November 20th, 2000 to March 26th, 2001 fulfilling their civic duty. None of the 12 jurors had a college degree, but Judge Michael Posner said that even with the highly technical nature of the evidence and testimony, he didn't believe that a formal education necessarily makes for a better juror. Though most judges do not allow jurors to take notes during the trial, Judge Posner did, which I think makes perfect sense.
Should we be preventing jurors from taking notes? I mean, they can't be expected to memorize all the evidence.
That's a really good point. Judge Posner ruled that the jury would not be allowed to hear about the bomb threat, Kristen's alleged attempt to kill her husband, or about the statistical analysis that concluded the chances of Kristen attending so many deaths simply by chance was an astronomical 1 in 100 million. Judge Posner said, put simply, any juror who was convinced that this defendant was the sort of person who would try to murder her husband would find it difficult, if not impossible, to avoid the temptation to conclude that the defendant was also the sort of person who would murder a hospital patient. To afford Kristen Gilbert a fair trial, the evidence must be excluded. Prosecutor William Welch said that the judge's ruling was forcing them to try the case with one arm tied behind their back, which I agree with.
Yeah, I get it's prejudicial, but she is exactly that sort of person
I mean, two things can be true.
that they can. A death penalty case requires a minimum of 2 defense attorneys, one of whom is death qualified, meaning that they have defended at least one prior capital case. David Hoos, one of Kristen's attorneys and the former president of the Massachusetts Citizens Against the Death Penalty, said that in a murder case where the scientific evidence is so uncertain, death should not be an option. He said no one had witnessed Kristen inject epinephrine into her patients, and since the patients were so ill, how could anyone determine that Kristen had done anything wrong? He also stated that patients at hospitals die all the time.
I mean, which is a winning endorsement.
Yeah, love that argument. He also said that James had turned on Kristen because of the problems they were having in their relationship. He argued that Kristen had never confessed to the killings. She was just angry with him when she called him from the psychiatric hospital and was trying to get a reaction from him when she said, I did it. I killed them.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a confession to me.
It sure does. But don't worry, he of course had an explanation for the missing epinephrine too. He blamed other nurses with drug problems for stealing the medication. Finally, for the pièce de résistance, he said federal prosecutors were going after Kristen because she was a white woman and they wanted to balance out the high percentage of minority men on death row.
I guess reverse racism was alive and well.
Wow. Just wow.
Yeah, people's awfulness never really, doesn't not surprise me, not at all. Anyway,
Yeah.
the crux of the trial was dueling medical evidence with a lot of not easily explained medical findings. Both sides had a monumental task of presenting the complex evidence in a way that jurors could understand. This was harder still in that 2 patients were given epinephrine in an effort to revive them. So, distinguishing between the dose that Kristen gave them to go into cardiac arrest and then a later dose to revive them from the cardiac arrest was difficult to ascertain. Only Henry was autopsied shortly after death. The other 3 victims' tissue was not tested until after their bodies had been embalmed and buried for months. Toxicology analysis did find epinephrine in the tissue of all 4 men. Epinephrine had not been prescribed to any of the victims. Prosecutors said Kristen murdered her patients for the thrill of it and to impress her new lover, showing him the power that she had. Of the many patients she injected, Kristen was found to have successfully murdered four: Henry Houdin, Kenneth Cutting, Edward Skyra, and Stanley Jagodowski. Prosecutors believe there were many more murders that went undetected. Though Kristen's true motives are open to speculation, what is known is that Kristen did create emergencies by injecting patients with epinephrine, which caused healthy hearts to beat out of control and result in cardiac arrest. Sometimes this didn't happen immediately, and Kristen was able to leave the patient's room. Then, when the patient was found and a code blue was initiated, Kristen would rush to the patient's room to ensure that she would be the one to try and bring them back.
After 12 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Kristen was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder. Before sentencing, jurors heard from the family members of the victims, who pushed for Kristen to be sentenced to death for the cruelty she had inflicted on their loved ones. Kristen's dad showed pictures of her as a small girl, and her grandmother remembered baking cookies with Kristen as a child.
I assume the point was to humanize Kristen, but talking about what a sweet little girl she was has no bearing on the person that she became. And maybe that's too harsh.
No, I completely agree. I don't believe in the death penalty, but I also don't think you can argue that who someone was in the past somehow completely excuses their present actions. She wasn't experiencing a psychotic break, she was responsible for the murders.
Exactly.
Still, poor Glenn had written a statement saying that he believed executing Kristen would have a profoundly detrimental effect on her young sons. The jury was then tasked with determining if Kristen should be put to death or condemned to life in prison. To be sentenced to death, the federal jury had to reach a unanimous vote. And after 2 days of deliberation, the jurors were deadlocked regarding the death penalty. On March 27, 2001, with only one option remaining, Judge Posner sentenced Kristen to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kristen had escaped death by lethal injection, which would have been karmic for someone whose method of murder was a lethal injection. Kristen was intent on appealing her conviction until she learned that a retrial, just like the original trial, could result in a death sentence. Judge Posner said that overseeing Kristen's case was the most complicated and stressful thing he had ever done. Kristen is serving her sentence at the Federal Medical Center Carswell, a federal prison for female inmates with special medical and mental health needs in Fort Worth, Texas.
Earlier this year, Kristen petitioned a judge to cap the garnishment of her prison wages. A virtual hearing was held to decide to either adjust or terminate the financial arrangement. Kristen's motion was denied. At Kristen's sentencing in 2001, Judge Posner saddled Kristen with $1.5 million in fines and $30,000 in restitution. These amounts are looked at as symbolic rather than realistic because the amount of money inmates get from prison jobs is minuscule. The government has continued to mandate that Kristen pay $25 quarterly or $100 a year to chip away at the debt. Maybe, like me, you thought that prisoners get a small amount of money from prison work to buy things like, I don't know, better snacks. And I feel rather naive saying that.
I don't think it's naive. How much time does the average person spend thinking about what prisoners use their wages on?
That's true. So, what does Kristen need money for? Well, a lot, actually. Attorney Hughes said the inmates have to pay for telephone usage, video calls, over the counter medications, including allergy medication, cough drops, higher quality toiletries, band aids, and they also have to ration toilet paper or pay $2.25 per roll for extras, along with paying $2 for medical visits. Additionally, money sent to Kristen by her family increases the amount she is deemed able to pay quarterly. Attorney Hoos argued that the result of that is Kristen's family being the de facto payer of the restitution. He summed it up by sharing what someone in law enforcement once told him: they are here as punishment, not for punishment. What do you think of that? Did you realize inmates had to pay for necessities?
I didn't, and I hardly think it's fair that her family should be saddled with the debt.
Yeah, I feel like her wages should be garnished, but money her family sends shouldn't be.
Agreed. I also don't think we can deny even the most evil of people toilet paper.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I'm not saying prisoners should be living a life of luxury, obviously not, but the basics need to be provided. This isn't scandal. We can't just throw people into a hole.
That's that's a good reference. I think both Jake and Huck were held in, I don't know why I remember this, were held in a hole by B613. And I think Jake came out of that situation much better than Huck did.
You would know better than I did. You actually finished the series.
I did.
Next week, we'll be continuing our theme of female killer nurses when we delve deep into the Victorian era case of Amelia Dyer. All the sources we used for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or theme for us to discuss, you can email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast on Instagram and at terrifyinglytypicalpod on TikTok. Feel free to leave us a comment, rating, or review to let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you next week.